We Jews have a problem with leadership. We need leaders, and then we destroy them. We elevate leaders, and then we pick them to death. We cannibalize our own. And this is nothing new. This has gone on since the very beginning of Jewish experience. You remember back in the book of Exodus. Any people that begins its national narrative with the story of an escape from tyranny is going to have a lifelong problem with authority. Because anyone who shows up and claims authority is going to look a lot like Pharaoh. Eliyahu Hanavi. Some enchanted evening, could you put the lights on? The lights have just gone out in the house, which is fine with me, but they're sitting in the dark, and there you go. It's a strange place. We run away from tyranny, and so any potential leader is going to look a lot like Pharaoh. And the book of Exodus tips us off. You remember the career of Moses. On his very first day as an adult, he goes out into the community in the 3rd chapter of Exodus, and he sees 2 Israelites fighting with each other. No, he first sees an Israelite being beaten to death by an Egyptian, remember? And he saves the Israelite by killing the Egyptian. On the 2nd day, he goes out and sees 2 Israelites fighting with each other, and he says to the one, "Why are you beating your friend to death?" And he looks up at him and he says, "Who made you leader?" Now, that's a really strangely ironic statement, because he's the Prince of Egypt, for God's sakes, and these are slaves. But that statement, "Who made you leader?" is a deep insight into the character of the Jewish people. We are never going to be easy on our leaders. We are never going to accept them with ease. That's one side of the paradox. The other side of the paradox is presented in a counter-narrative in the 32nd chapter of Exodus, which is the story of the golden calf. Moses, you remember, goes to the top of the mountain to get the 10 Commandments, and he leaves Aaron to babysit. And as soon as he goes away for 40 days, the people jump on Aaron and say, "Make us a god, because that man Moses who took us out of Egypt is gone." The story of the golden calf is that absent a strong leader, a visible leader, a powerful leader who captures the imagination and loyalty of this people, absent strong leadership, this people falls apart politically and spiritually. These 2 narratives coexist in the Jewish consciousness forever. We need leaders, otherwise we cannot be the people we are meant to be. But as soon as anyone stands up to become a leader, we immediately destroy them. This confrontation of these 2 narratives, these 2 parts of the Jewish soul, comes together in the book that we're reading now, the book of Judges. The book of Judges takes place after Moses has succeeded in carrying us across the desert. Joshua succeeds him and takes over leadership of the people. And according to the book of Joshua, which is the 6th book of the Bible, Joshua conquers the land of Israel, conquers the land of Canaan, the promised land, and settles the tribes in the land. And then he dies. And when he dies, he leaves no government behind. Only the tribes with their tribal elders. So if you imagine that there are 2 parties at work in the Jewish consciousness, one which is the party which militates for strong leadership, and the other which is the party which militates against strong leadership and says, God is our leader, we don't need strong leadership. The second party, that's the party, or the anarchy party as it were, takes over. And we are settled in the land without a strong leader. And for 200 years, we're going to live under those circumstances. Now, there's another fact that gives the story its dynamic. Joshua, you remember, was supposed to conquer all the peoples that were resident in the land. And if you read the book of Joshua, it sure seems like he did it, because he goes from north to south, just wiping out all of the residents. But when you turn the page and enter the book of Judges, suddenly we are told he didn't conquer everybody. Not by a long shot. In fact, we're living in a fairly crowded neighborhood. We have neighbors. Now that brings two things to bear on Israelite life during the 200 years of the period of the Judges. Number one, we have neighbors, and we send our kids to high school, and they date the neighbors' kids, and they go out after football games on Friday night to McBall's, And they start marrying the neighbors' kids, and pretty soon we've adopted the religious practices and the cultural traditions of our neighbors. We begin to assimilate into the cultural background of ancient Canaan. Now, that's not to be unexpected. We offered our children an invisible God who lives out in the desert. The Babylonians offered him a very rich tradition of mythic images of God, very sexual, very sensual, very attractive, and more or less very effective. And so we begin to assimilate into the cultural religious background of ancient Canaan. The second is that because we're living among these other tribes, on occasion when these tribes or these city-states rise up in power, they invade Israelite territory and usurp Israelite territory and begin to rule over the Israelites. And according to the book of Judges, what would happen then is that we would live under their hegemony. The Israelites would live under the hegemony of these Canaanite or Midianite or Moabite tribes. And then a charismatic leader would rise up among us, gather a spontaneous militia, farmers with pitchforks, expel the invaders, and rule the land through his lifetime until he died, and it happened again. In every generation, another one of the city-states or the tribes that were surrounding the people Israel in the land of Israel would do this, and this was the pattern of the book of Judges. What the book of Judges does is connect these two phenomena. It connects our religious disloyalty with our political military defenselessness. It connects them and creates a polemic. A polemic is an argument. And the book of Judges that we're reading is an argument on behalf of strong leadership. Let me read you two sections from the book. If you happen to have a Bible with you, you're Jews, I know you go everywhere with a Bible. And it's Sunday morning, so why wouldn't you have a Bible? So turn to Judges chapter 2, beginning with the 6th verse. When Joshua dismissed the people, after making a covenant with the people, the Israelites went to their allotted territories and took possession of the land. The people served the Lord during the lifetime of Joshua and the lifetime of the older people who lived on after Joshua, who had witnessed all the marvelous deeds that the Lord had wrought for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 and was buried on his own property. And all that generation were likewise gathered unto their fathers. So the generation of the desert, the last vestige of the immigrant generation, dies off. And now a new generation arose. That is a native-born generation of Israelites, which had not experienced the deliverance of the Lord or the deeds that God had wrought for Israel. And the Israelites did what was offensive to the Lord. They worshipped the Baalim and forsook the Lord and the God of their fathers who brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods from among the gods of the people around them and bowed down to them and provoked them. They forsook the Lord and worshipped Baal and Ashtaroth. Baal was the great male god of the Canaanite pantheon. Remember that the land of Israel, geographically, much like California, doesn't have a river. Ancient Egypt has a river, which means there's always food. Mesopotamia has 2 rivers, which means there's always food. Canaan doesn't have a river. You depend upon rainfall. If it rains, we eat. If it doesn't rain, there's nothing to eat. You starve and you die. And so there is this nervousness, a sense of vulnerability of life that exists in ancient Canaan. And so what did our Canaanite neighbors do? They divided the universe into 2. They imagined that the God of the sky, the God who rains fruitful rain down on the land, is Baal, the masculine God. And they portrayed Baal, the masculine principle of the universe, by a bull. And every ancient Near Eastern home had a little bull figurine in it. We know this from archaeology. And the earth, the good and fertile earth, is Ashtoreth, or Ishtar, later to be called Esther. She is the goddess of the land, the goddess who receives the fructifying rain of the sky and grows all of the things that we need to eat. She is symbolized either by a tree, where she is worshipped, and at home she is symbolized by a small figurine of a young woman with enormous breasts and a swollen belly, sort of Britney Spears. Sorry. Ancient Near Eastern worship went something like this in the fall. When the farmer wanted to see the dry season of the summer turn into a glorious wet season filled with rain, that farmer would go out to his fields, either with his wife, or sometimes with a cultic prostitute, a cultic priestess, who was game. And they would go out to the fields, and on the night when the moon is full, in the month of Tishrei, they would have union in that field, physical union in that field. And at the moment of truth, he would pour his seed out on the field, thereby, by sympathetic magic, encouraging Baal, the sky god, to pour his fructifying rain out on the field as well. That, ladies and gentlemen, is religion. We brought that back, people come to shul. That's the Baal and the Ashtera that our ancestors took on. Why did they take it on? Because they felt the vulnerability of living in a land without sure rainfall. And because these were such vivid images, because they were so sort of archetypal, they're so built into the human being. Now, of course, what the rabbis did generations later is take the same rituals and kosher them. They koshered these rituals. And so on the 14th day of Tishrei, you and I don't go out to our fields, we go out build a sukkah in my backyard. I don't know what goes on in your sukkah. And they give us lulavs and etrogs. Lulavs, these tall, phallic green things that you wave around a synagogue, and etrogs, these big, uterine-looking, womby things. You're never going to have sukkahs again, are you? And we march around the synagogue praying for rain. It's the same ritual. It's not nearly the same ritual. I've tried both, and it's not even close. So they worship the Baal and the Ashterot. They took on these very sensuous Canaanite idolatrous practices. Now listen what happens. This is how the book of Judges interprets the politics of its day. Because the Bible is not simply a record of what happened. It's somebody's interpretation of what happened. So it connected the two facts of the religious disloyalty with the political defensiveness. Then the Lord was incensed at Israel, and he handed them over to their foes, who plundered them. He surrendered them to their enemies on all sides, and they could no longer hold their own against their enemies. In all their campaigns, the hand of the Lord was against them to their undoing. As the Lord had declared and as the Lord had sworn to them until they were in great distress, then the Lord raised up chieftains. The Hebrew name for the book is called Judges, it's Shoftim, but the real name is chieftains. These were warlords. We would say gang leaders, right? Chieftains who delivered them from those who plundered them. But they did not heed the chieftains either. They went astray after other gods and bowed down to them. They were quick to turn aside from the way of their fathers and followed in obedience to the commandments of the Lord. They did not do what was right. When the Lord raised up chieftains for them, the Lord would be with the chieftain and would save them from their enemies during the chieftain's lifetime. For the Lord would be moved to pity by their moanings because of those who oppressed and crushed them. But when the chieftain died, they would act basely even more than the preceding generation, following other gods, worshiping them and bowing down. They admitted none of the practices in their stubborn ways. So what we have here is an historical cycle. We know, according to the Bible, in every generation during the 200 years between Joshua's conquest of the land and the rise of David, king of Israel, in those 200 years, in each successive generation, there was an invasion of some other one of the local tribes. And the way the book of Judges understands it, it's an historical cycle. We worship the idols of the land. God abandons us. The local tribes invade. They crush us. We moan, we pray, we plead with God. God sends a chieftain to rescue us. He raises an army, or in this case, she raises an army and saves us. We live under the hegemony of the authority of that chieftain in faithfulness until the chieftain dies, and then we go back to our idolatrous ways, and the whole cycle repeats itself. You can see where this is going. The book of Judges is a polemic on behalf of the party that wanted strong leadership to show you what happens when the people Israel have no strong leadership. And I'll prove it to you because I'll read you the very last line. Again, if you happen to have a Bible with you, the last line of the book of Judges, the very last line of the book is as follows. It says, "Bayamim hahem ein melech b'Yisrael isha ashar be'enav ya'aseh." In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did as he damn well pleased. That's the story of the book of Judges. So what we have here is a set of historical circumstances which is turned into an historical polemic on behalf of a strong leader, namely a king. This is propaganda created by the house of David to justify and legitimize the rise of Davidic kingship, which is going to come right after this book is completed. Now, there's one other aspect to it which makes it quite wonderful. Who were the judges? If you look at the book of Judges, one after the other, these chieftains, these judges who rise up to save us, are the most unlikely of people. Now, you could see where on one level, this would be a way of saying it wasn't the chieftain who rescued us, it was the Lord God. In the same way that Moses is a stuttering prophet, so that you know that the words that he speaks are not his own, but God's words, you could say that the reason why each of the chieftains is a disqualified leader is because it's not the leader who's rescuing you. He's not divine, it's God. But the polemic of the book of Judges makes this better. Because it says, look what happens to you when you have no real leader. Look what happens to you when you have no king. You have to rely on all sorts of strange people to rescue. So the first leader, the first chieftain, is a man named Ehud, who has no right hand. He's a left-handed guy. And let me tell you, you can't trust left-handed people. I mean, my God. And he actually uses that as his subterfuge to kill the Moabite king, whose name is Eglon. The second one is one who only occurs in 2 lines. His name is Shamgar, which only means he lived over there. He was anonymous. The third of the judges is the one we're going to talk about today. That's Deborah. Now, ladies and gentlemen, and particularly the gentlemen in the room, can you imagine what a people we are? A woman had to save us. What the hell is wrong with you guys? And if you read the story of Deborah, and you have it in front of you, so now you can read it, you'll notice that there's this tension between her and between the hero whose name is Barak. Barak, who's the general, doesn't want to fight. She has to keep saying, what kind of man are you anyway? Right? She's sort of the Jewish mother of the book of Judges, you know? Get up and do something. It takes a woman to save us. And then in the next generation, the judge is a man named Gideon, who's an atheist. He doesn't believe in God. And what's funny in the book is that even God couldn't get him to believe in God. And then the one after that is a man named Yiftach, whose mother was a whore and whose father was a crook. Right? He was an outcast. And then finally you arrive at the greatest of all the judges, the most famous one of all, Samson. Samson is walking id. Think Sylvester Stallone without the intelligence. In every scene of the story of Samson, and you'll excuse me for making an R-rated comment, he's either screwing someone or killing someone. He kills the one he screws the one he kills. He doesn't really care. It's all bloodshed and sex. It made great Hollywood script. Samson is a man with no inner life. He's a walking penis. He's walking testosterone. He is a man of no spirituality, no conscience, no reflection. He's just testosterone embodied. And he is the one who's going to save you, ladies and gentlemen. Is it not clear that we need a king? That's what the book of Judges is all about. It is a book about spiritual and political anarchy. And in a time of political anarchy, we lose it both spiritually and politically, and that's why the book of Judges becomes this wonderful polemic for a religious political order which is going to be headed by a man named David in the next generation. It's a prelude to the Davidic kingship. Now, that's the book as a whole. The story that we're going to read today is the story of the second or third judge, whose name is Devorah, and you'll see that on the sheet in front of you. It's in chapter 4, and the facts of the story are fairly simple. But the legalities of the story you know that these guys are going to make a real big deal about. Chapter 4, the Israel... I don't have the sheet. Yes, the Israelites did again what was offensive to the Lord. Ehud now being dead. Ehud was the last judge, okay? Now, by the way, if these names are familiar to you, Ehud was the judge, and the general's name is Barak, you know? Because all of you know that when people came to Israel from Poland, their names were, Yerachmiel Rubushgubishgbich. And when the immigration officer in Tel Aviv, in Jaffa, said, "What's your name?" You said, "Ehud Barak." I said, "Go," That's how I got to be Edward Feinstein. Did you know that? Sean Ferguson, you know that joke, right? The Lord surrendered them to King Yavin of Canaan, who reigned in Chatzor. Anyone know where Chatzor is? Okay, so you know where the Afula, where you go to Hadera, you turn right, and there's a Wadi Ara, there's a road, right? And you go past Megiddo to Afula. Afula is the bus station with the best falafel in Israel, right? Slightly north of Afula is Chatzor. There's a tell there. You can see the tell, and behind it is Mount Tavor, which all this is going to take place. This is right smack in the middle of Israel, on the highway between Damascus and Alexandria, okay? His army's commander was Sisera, whose base was Haroshet Goyim, right? Which is a funny way. It's like where the Goyim went to thresh their floor, I'm sure that's not what they called it, The Israelites cried out to the Lord, for he had 900 iron chariots. That's probably an exaggeration. Even if he had one, it would have been scary as hell, because the chariot did to ancient warfare what the tank did in World War I. And he oppressed Israel ruthlessly for 20 years. Dvorah, wife of Lapidot, was a prophetess. Now, one of the things about the names are significant. Lapidot means lightning flashes, right? And Barak means thunder. Now, what might have happened here is, and this is kind of tangential, but what might have happened here is there might have been a legend about the thunder and lightning gods and their battle between each other that we sort of took in and used as a format for this story. Dvorah, wife of Lapidot, was prophetess, and she led Israel at the time, and she used to sit under the palm of Devorah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, which is smack in the middle of the country. It's what we call today the West Bank, okay? And the Israelites would come to her for decisions. She summoned Barak, son of Abinoam of Kadesh and Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, has commanded, go march up to Mount Tabor and take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zvulun, and I will draw Sisera, Yabin's army commander, with his chariots and troops toward you to Wadi Kishon, and I'll deliver him in your hands." And Barak said, if you will go with me. And Barak said to her, "If you will go with me, I will go, but if not, I won't go." In other words, I'm afraid. Barak is not a soldier. He's a farmer. And the question is, does he have sufficient charisma to command an army, to bring an army together and get them so riled up that they want to fight? And he says, "I can't do this, but you have to go because you're the recognized leader of the generation." Now, there's a dynamic between women and men in this story, which is very interesting because it's backwards. You would expect the man to take the commanding position and the woman to be subservient. But in this case, it's exactly the opposite. Like it is so many times in the Bible, it's the woman who has the vision of the covenantal drama and where we sit in the covenantal drama, and men typically are clueless, okay? Just to tell you that nothing's changed, you see? "Very well, I'll go with you," she says, "but there'll be no glory for you in the course of your taking, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." So she plays on this. And she says, "Great, is that what you want people to say about you for the rest of history? That a woman had to bail you out, right?" So Deborah went up to Barak, with Barak to Kadesh, and Barak mustered Zvulun and Naphtali. So Zvulun and Naphtali are the northern tribes in the Galil. At Kadesh, 10,000 men marched up after him, and Dvorah went with him. And now we have a separate drama. So now, meanwhile, as they say in movies, Chever the Canaanite has separated himself from the other Canaanites, descendants of Chobab, father-in-law of Moshe, and pitched his tent in Elon Betzanaim, which is near Kadesh. Now, there is this tribe called the Canaanites. And they are not Canaanites. They are not people of the land we were commanded to destroy, but nor are they Israelites. They're in an in-between category, and the Bible assigns them as descendants of Moses' father-in-law. Because they have to have some kind of status, but they're not in anybody's territory. And this we're going to take up in a moment when we talk about the legalities of the story. They're friends of the Jews, but they're not Jews. And part of the problem with Jews is that Jews don't know who their friends are and have a hard time accepting the friendship of non-Jews because we assign everybody to the category of Goyim. No, this is true. It's a funny thing, by the way, because, we're 1/3 of 1/10 of 1% of the world's population, but we call all of them non-Jews. I have a friend who's Chinese, and he once heard me use that word. He was staying at my house for Shabbos, and I said something about non-Jews, and he said, now I know who I am. He says, I was so worried I didn't have identity in the world. Now I know I'm a non-Jew. And just because there's 1,200,000,000 of us, and how many? 7 of you, Non-Jew, we do this. So we divide the world so nice and neatly. Us, them, our Jews. In Israel, they do the same thing, right? Israel, which is the size of Connecticut, becomes Aretz, and every place else in the world is Chutz La'aretz, which is like just on the other side of the fence, right? So we don't know what to do with these Canaanites. And when the lawyers get here a little bit later, this is one of the questions I want you to ask them. What is the legal status of Canaanites? Which is very interesting, by the way, and I don't want to get political, but what is the legal status of people who live on the West Bank who are not Jewish? This is a very interesting set of issues. We'll come back to that in a moment. Chaver, the Chaver, his name is Chaver. Does that tell you who he is, right? Oh, Chaver, right? The Canaanites separate himself, right? Sisera was informed that Barak, the son of Eglon, to Mount Tabor. Sisera ordered his chariots, 900 chariots, all the troops to move. Deborah said to Barak, up! She's always telling him to get going because he's like this schlepper, tomorrow, we'll get to it. Mañana, machar. Get up, she says. This is the day you're going to fight. Barak charged down Mount Tabor, followed by 10,000 men. The Lord threw Sisera and all of his chariots into a panic. Of course, because Tabor is a low-sloping mountain. What happened was Barak and his guys hid on the mountain. Deborah lured Sisera to the bottom of the mountain. The chariots were gathered, and having the advantage of a downhill slope where the chariots couldn't follow the men up the hill, Barak had an easy time destroying them. Barak charged down Mount Tabor, followed by 10,000 men. The Lord threw Sisera and his chariots into a panic. Before the onslaught of Barak, Sisera leaped from his chariot and fled on foot as Barak pursued the chariots and the soldiers as far as their headquarters, and all of Sisera's soldiers fell. Not a man was left. Sisera, meanwhile, had fled on foot to the tent of Yael, wife of Chever the Canaanite. For there was friendship between King Yavin of Chatzor and the family of Chever the Canaanite. The Canaanites were everybody's friends. They were neutral. So he thought he was going to be safe there. Yael came out to greet Sisera and said, "Come in, my lord, come in, do not be afraid." So he entered his tent and she covered him with a blanket. So poor guy had been fighting all day and he's exhausted. So he finds refuge in the tent. And what does he think about her? He thinks, number one, that she is the wife of an ally. And number two, she's only a woman. She can't do anything to him. He's this big, strong hero. This whole story is about what happens when men underestimate women, right? It's a headache, as you'll see in a moment. "Please come in, my lord, and do not be afraid." So he entered the tent. She covered him with a blanket, and he said to her, "Please let me have some water. I'm thirsty." So she opened a skin of milk and gave him some to drink, and she covered him again. So milk is a soporific, puts you to sleep, right? And he said to her, "Stand at the entrance of the tent. If anybody comes and asks you if anybody's here, say no." So Sisera in some ways sounds a lot like Barak. These are men who are evading responsibility. Why would the general of the Canaanite king be so afraid? And why did he desert the battle? Neither he nor Barak are particularly heroic in this story, especially compared to the women in this story. So he said to her, "Stand at the tent." Then Yael, wife of Chever, took a tent pin and grasped the mallet. And when he was fast asleep from exhaustion, she approached him stealthily and drove the pin through his temple till it went down to the ground, and thus he died. Duh. The commentary of Rashi is, I hate when they do this. It just really hurts. Now Barak appeared in pursuit of Sisera, and Yael went out to greet him and said, "Come, I'll show you the man you're looking for." And she went in, and there was Sisera lying dead with a pin in his temple. Right? On that day, God subdued King. So who is the hero here? Right, it's Deborah on the Israelite side, and Yael on the... And in both cases, what do you see? The men are passive. How did Sisera die? Did he die in battle, fighting gloriously? He was asleep. He died in his sleep. He literally died in his sleep with a tent peg smashed through his head, right? At the hand of Yael the Chever, the Canaanite. So the women are the active ones, and the men are the passive ones in the story. And this, again, is either part of the ancient myth of thunder and lightning, which is possible. It's also part of the polemic of the book of Judges to say that in an age without strong leadership, the social order is turned upside down. Men act like women, and women act like men. And that's the problem with a world without a king, ladies and gentlemen. Now Barak, so what happens on that day, God subdued King Yavin of Hatzor before the Israelites. The hand of the Israelites bore harder on King Yavin until they destroyed King Yavin of Canaan. That's our story. That's our story. Now I want to suggest 3 questions that I think you ought to ask these lawyers as they get into this. No doubt they're going to have a lot of fun with the story. And by the way, the next, you don't have the next chapter, unfortunately, because in the next chapter there's a song. And biblical songs are very beautiful because even though they're difficult to read, the Hebrew is very ancient. They give you an ancient version of the story before the prose was written. And I want to read you just 2 lines from the Song of Deborah. And then I'd like to wrap up these issues so that the lawyers can come out here and confuse you further. Okay? So the Song of Deborah begins by saying, "Hear, O kings, give ear, O potentates, I will sing to the Lord. With him the Lord and glory of Israel. O Lord, you came forth from Seir, advanced from the country of Edom. The earth trembled, the heavens dripped. Yea, the clouds dripped water. The mountains quake before the Lord, him of Sinai, before the Lord, God of Israel." What's the theme of rain? Remember the story? He has 900 chariots gathered at the bottom of Mount Tabor. Now, what happens if you're in a land of sort of soft earth and it rains on the mountain? What's going to happen? The mud is going to make the wheels of the chariots stick. And chariots now become ineffective. In fact, they become more than ineffective. They become the traps, the death traps of those who have come to fight in them. So that's one of the issues, right? And now we have a telling of the story. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anat, in the days of Yael, caravans ceased, wayfarers went by roundabout paths, deliverance ceased in Israel, till you arose, O Devorah. Arose, O mother in Israel. They chose new gods. Was there a fighter in the gates? No shield or spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. My heart is with Israel's leaders, with the dedicated of the people. Bless the Lord. And they tell the fact that there was no one to protect the people. And then you have this beautiful phrase in the poem. Awake, awake, O Deborah. Awake, awake, strike up the chant. Awake, Barak, take your captives. And then we have this interesting comment that the poem throws in. Listen carefully. From Ephraim there came up those whose roots, and after you, your kin Binyamin. From Machar came down leaders, from Zvulun, such as hold the marshal's staff. What happened was they had a hard time gathering troops. They got troops from the smaller tribes of Zvulun and Naphtali and Issachar. But among the clans of Reuven were great decisions of heart. Why then do you stay among the sheepfolds and listen as they pipe for the flocks among the clans of Reuben? This took place in the middle of Israel, and Reuven, which is the biggest tribe of the north of Israel, wouldn't come down to fight. That is, that the mutual defense pact among the Israelite tribes failed. The reason why Deborah had to be so successful with the very few troops that she had, the reason why we needed a miracle of rain on the mountain to stop the chariots, was because she was unsuccessful in gathering up an army to protect the people of Israel. Which is the very reason why the time of Judges was such a difficult time. It was difficult to get the tribes to defend each other. Because what happened at this moment is that tribal identity became a whole lot more important than national identity. And people began to ask the question, if I am in Reuben and I am in the north, and you are in Judah and you are in the south, what do we have in common together? We don't have anything in common. Why should I come and fight for you? This issue of national identity versus tribal identity, and the incapacity of leaders to gather us up into one national identity. This is the great plague of the time of the Judges. And what's going to happen later, I'll give you the end of the story. What's going to happen later, of course, is that the King David is going to come. And David is the king who creates such a persona that he gathers us up into one nation. We become one national entity under David. In a real way, you could say that it was King David who invented the idea of the people Israel. Up until that time, if I were to ask you, what is your identity? You'd tell me your clan and your tribe and your region, but you wouldn't tell me that you were an Israelite. That was a secondary, a tertiary identity. It's King David who creates the identity of the people Israel. Which is why, by the way, and he was so good at it, which is why that to this very day, little kids will sit in my nursery school and sing, David, Melech Yisrael, Chai Chai V'Kayam. David, king of Israel, is alive and well. That's pretty good for a guy who's been dead for 3,000 years. Because it means that as long as the people Israel lives, as long as there is an identity and a solidarity and a sense of mutual responsibility among the people Israel, David, king of Israel, lives. That was the malady that David tried to solve. He couldn't get the tribes to work together, to fight together, to share a common destiny. This was one of the issues. Now let me suggest 3 legal issues. Not being a lawyer, what do I know? Number 1. Today, and I don't want to get political. I'm not trying to be political. I just want to show you this as an example. Suppose on the West Bank today, there is an altercation between an Israeli settler who's living in a settlement on the West Bank and a Palestinian neighbor, and one of the two of them gets killed. In what court does this case get adjudicated? Right, that's the right answer. Nobody knows. If the Israeli gets killed and the Palestinian is the perpetrator or the suspect, it's tried in an Israeli military court. If the Palestinian gets killed and it's the Israeli who's the suspect, it gets tried in an Israeli civil court. If the Palestinian Arab is not a resident of the West Bank but has somehow snuck in, let's say he's from Egypt or from Gaza and snuck in, then it's tried in a third court. What is the legal jurisdiction here? You have Israelites, Canaanites, and Kenites. Whose court does this belong to? Which set of laws are we trying this case under? Israelite law, Canaanite law, or Kenite law? So when the judge comes out, I want you to ask him who he is. Is he an Israelite lawyer, an Israelite judge, a Canaanite judge, or a Kenite judge? You have Yael, who is Kenite. You have Sisera, who is Canaanite. You have Deborah, who is Israelite. Whose law counts? That's a serious question. In Israel, in the West Bank right now, it's a very serious issue because it has to do not only with criminal law, it has to do with land acquisition. If the Israeli government or if an Israeli settlement wants to acquire land on the West Bank, under whose laws do you acquire that land? And how do you know the land is really acquired? This is a deep political, ethical issue in Israel to this day. And it's the issue that's going to be fought out here in a few moments. Whatever they decide in terms of the evidence, you could claim jurisdictional misappropriation. Whatever that means. Second, here's a second problem, which again is political, and I apologize for this. This was a war. Now, it wasn't a declared war, but it was a war. Sisera had oppressed the Israelites. Sisera and Yavin had oppressed the Sis. So this is a war between Deborah and Barak, representing the Israelites on one side of a war, and Sisera on the other side of the war. So we have combatants. Yael is what? Is she a combatant or a non-combatant? What happens when a combatant and a non-combatant have an altercation? Now here's another. We have this problem right here. You have guys in Guantanamo Bay. We have guys in Guantanamo Bay who we have designated as terrorists. What makes you a terrorist? A terrorist is a warrior, a combatant who engages in violence against non-combatants. In which legal jurisdiction do you try them? Military, civilian, or some other one? Yael is a non-combatant. Sisera was a combatant. If she kills a combatant, is she part of the war? Is she not part of the war? Is this a war crime? Is this a civil crime? Is this simply murder? What happens here? That's a second issue. Here's a third issue. You can see that the story has a great deal to do with the relative position of women and men. Do women and men fall under the same legal jurisdiction? Do they have the same laws? If a woman, Yael is at home alone. Now, first of all, that's an interesting thing. What is she doing at home alone? Why is she at home alone? Where are her men? Why was there no one there to defend her? Can she see, is a woman at home alone presumed to be at risk? And if a woman at home alone is presumed to be at risk, does this involve an act of self-defense? Okay? And then there's the milk. I don't know what that has to do with the story, but somehow I just have this sneaking suspicion that either Laurie or Erwin is going to blame the milk. So if you're the dairyman, if there's anybody here from K-Swiss, I want to apologize on behalf of the university. The book of Judges raises a very interesting question. I'll finish very quickly. Not just the question of Yael and Sisera, not just the question of women and men, not just this question of, but it raises a very interesting question. How do you lead a holy community? Who do we embrace as our leaders? And what do we do to our leaders? The book of Judges recognizes that without strong leadership, a holy community cannot persist. But it also understands that it's difficult to be a leader in a holy community. And what do we have to do to embrace those leaders and give them the strength to do what it is that we all know we need them to do? That's the great question of this book. Enjoy the trial.
This is the case of people versus Yael. You're going to decide a question that was not answered in the Bible or not answered by history, and that is whether or not she is guilty of murder. You're all jurors in this case. I'm going to, at this time, bring out and introduce to you the advocates for the people. The prosecution in this case, Professor Laurie Levenson from Loyola Law School, who's also the director of the Center for Ethical Advocacy. Some of you all know very well. And for the defendant, the founding dean of the law school at the University of California at Irvine, Erwin Chemerinsky. Now, as I said, you've all been summoned to be jurors here. Ordinarily, the selection of jury is a very elaborate process. It can take hours, days sometimes, for the lawyers to be satisfied that we have fair and impartial jurors. But all of you have been pre-screened. I understand that you're all exceptionally bright, fair, objective, and impartial, so there's no need for any further questions along those lines. You're all accepted and were instructed to serve as jurors and to follow the laws as I give them to you. And also in a jury trial, the lawyers during this jury selection process have an opportunity to exercise what we call peremptory challenges. That means they can excuse jurors for any reason they want. But these lawyers have no interest in that. They're accepting all of you as well, so we can proceed. Usually the next phase of the trial is the presentation of evidence. We don't need that here because although all the evidence in this case is hearsay, we have a well-recognized exception to the law. That's the American Jewish University exception to the hearsay rule. So all of the evidence is admitted that you have before you. As you know, the charges in this case are one of murder. I'm going to give you instructions later as to what the law involves. Just so you understand, we are applying California law, notwithstanding this may have occurred outside the borders of California, in another country, by someone who's not even around. Minor technicalities. We're applying California law, just so you understand. So, Once the jury is selected, the evidence is presented, we next move to the stage of the trial, which you're now going to hear, and that's the arguments of counsel. The way it's going to proceed is the prosecutor will give an opening argument, then the defense will argue, then the prosecutor will have a rebuttal, and the defense will have a rebuttal, and then I will instruct you on the law, and you will make the decision for all of history whether Yael was or was not guilty of murder. So, Professor Levenson, you may argue the case for the people.
May it please the court, ladies and gentlemen, and my dear friend, Erwin. Here we go again. Now, this client has gone too far. As you know, my esteemed colleague specializes in representing rogues in the Bible. You know, people who try to kill their children, who sleep with other people's wives, who steal from other people's gardens, but never before has he stooped so low. You know, Erwin is a bit of a softie, taken in by that pretty woman Yael, and this same man who professes to be committed to justice and the rule of law now tries to stand beside a confessed murderer. Yes, that is who Yael is, a confessed murderer and an assassin, a cold-blooded murderess who killed a man when he was already down, right there in her tent, when he was sleeping, when he was defeated, when he was scared. She nailed him. Thus leading to the expression, dead as a doornail. Now, let me introduce to you the victim in this case. That would be Sisera, harmless at the moment he was killed. And the defendant, there she is, the seductress, Yael. Now, when you came today, you were probably saying, who is this Yael? We don't hear a lot about her. We don't talk about her like Sarah and Rebecca and Miriam and even Deborah. We talk about her in hushed tones. She's the Shanda, Yael. And that's because of what happened in this case. So let's go over the evidence, because that's what you should decide your verdict on, that this, in fact, was murder. You have before you the transcript of this case. And starting with line 17, it says that Sisera has fled on foot to the tent of Yael. He is no danger to anyone. He's gone to a friend of the family, not an enemy. And she greets him. She comes out. She says, "Come in, my lord. Come in here. Do not be afraid. Have a little nosh. I'll take care of you. We're friends. We're family." And he goes in. And she covers him with a blankie. Then he pathetically says to her, "Please, may I have some water? I'm thirsty." He even says, "Please." What kind of man does that? But she has a plan. She gives him milk to drink, her own version of propofol. And she covers him and says, "Nighty-night." Then comes the betrayal. He asks her nicely, "Stand at the entrance of the tent. You know, if anybody comes, just say no." And she and he both know, in fact, people are coming. He's not on the prowl to get anyone. They are hunting him. So what does she do? She waits for him to fall asleep. And then she grabs a tent pin And then she grabs a mallet. May I have a volunteer, please? And she pounds, and she pounds, and she pounds, and she pounds, and she pounds until that stake ends up into the ground. She approaches him stealthily to do this. She nails him right there. She's not fooling around. She doesn't want her prize to get away. And as the rabbi said, thus he died. No kidding. At that point, she's got her prize. She proudly shows others what she has done. This is an assassination, plain and sure. And we call it first-degree murder. And no matter what side you have been on in this conflict, whether it's with Sisera or Barak, what she did violates the laws of both peacetime and war. And I know the rabbi wanted to jump into that law stuff. He's really good on the rabbi stuff. But where he missed a step is that it really wouldn't matter, because she was in violation of the laws of the domestic countries and as well the laws of war. The war was over. Read your transcript. She knew it, and everyone in town knew it, especially since she was with friends and family. And not once does it say, as suggested by the rabbi, that she needed to kill in self-defense. I challenge you, look over that transcript, every single line. At no point did Sisera pose any type of threat. You know, she was more like those people we've seen on television lately, those really ugly images that at least disgust me, that when you have a defeated enemy, the mob goes out and nearly tears him limb by limb, and then shows him as some type of prize. No one is saying that Sisera is a good guy, but she, Yael, had no right to take the law in her own hands. There is such a thing as the rule of law. We have trials. We have justice. She made herself the prosecutor, the judge, and the executioner. Let's talk a little bit about the law of murder, as the judge will instruct you. On the law of murder, oh yes, we had video cameras catching the scene. All that is required, as you'll hear Judge Pines instruct you, is that 1, she caused Sisera's death. No big debate about that. 2, that she intentionally caused his death. This was no slip of hand. That nail went all the way through. And 3, the most you'll have to decide is it first degree or second degree murder? For first degree murder, you have to decide, was it willful, deliberate, premeditated? No specific amount of time is needed. All you need is a cold, calculated decision. That she looks around. She says, what do I have handy to knock out that guy? And she finds her weapons right at hand. And she uses one she knows will be effective. She was lying in wait. She had lulled her victim into submission, and she viciously killed him. Now, I know about this group. You always like to rule with Erwin. I get it, after 9 years. So I decided to throw him a bone this year. If you really feel compelled to show some rochmanis on him and his client, there's a way to do that and still uphold the law. You will be given an instruction on second-degree murder. When does that apply? If, in fact, you find there was the intent to kill, but maybe you don't think it was as premeditated as at least I do. The prosecution in this case is not particularly greedy. We just want to see some kind of justice. Justice because she had a plan. Justice because she had a motive. You heard the rabbi himself say she needed to be a hero. These women needed to prove to the guys that they could get the job done. Well, that's fine. You want to be like the guys? Take the same responsibility as the guys. When you commit murder, you are responsible for it. And she picked a hell of a manner. Now, You never know what's going to come out of the defense's mouth here. He is a wily one. He seems to have an excuse for everyone. In fact, I bet that Dr. Conrad Murray wished that Erwin had represented him. But there is no defense in this case. In terms of the defense, I might hear, and you might hear, well, poor Yael. It was a mistake. She thought the war was still raging, and the enemy of the general had just dropped by her for a quickie, and this was her chance to win the war for everybody. But, ladies and gentlemen, that is a creative reading of the text. As you read it yourself, you know that the war was over. Everybody else had been killed. All the chariots had been wiped out. Cicero was a threat to no one. He was out to get no one, and she knew it as well. He was being hunted. And how about self-defense? I don't even think the professor, the dean, is going to argue that, because it wouldn't work. There's no imminent threat to anyone. For goodness sake, he's asleep. And for as much as you might want to kill your spouse in his sleep, you don't do it, do you? Because it is not self-defense. Finally, she had no reason to fear him. As the text tells you in line 17, there was a friendship between her tribe and his tribe. It was he who was afraid of her, not she afraid of him, which is exactly why the text says, "Come in, my Lord, come in here. Do not be afraid." It's not self-defense, it's a setup. She is the Matahari of the Mishnah. And finally, what about necessity? What about, is this justified? Do the ends justify the means? We were able to kill off Cicero. But that's not how the law works. You can't say that because there was a war, you can now capture the defeated leaders and do to them anything you want. In fact, as I mentioned, and if you don't want to see a disturbing picture, look away now. How do we treat? I know, I usually make this all so happy. But this is a moment I really want us to think about. How do we treat defeated leaders? This was a brutal killing of a defeated soldier. There are laws of war. Once somebody is no longer engaged in combat, and Cicero was no longer engaged in combat, then the right thing to do is, as a prisoner, put him through what we do so well, a trial. And if we don't want to use our civilian courts, throw him in Guantanamo. But putting a stake through his temple is nothing that any law of war countenance. It is not how Israel treats its captives, and it's not how we would want other countries to treat ours. And so you have the opportunity today, for the sake of world peace and world justice, to find the right verdict. Now, in terms of this assassination, I thought I should look up to see what the great scholars of our time say about how to treat war defendants and assassins. And so I looked up the greatest of all. You know, Dean Chemerinsky, I know Dean Chemerinsky. And until today, I think Dean Chemerinsky was my friend. I hope he will still be. And I respect so much what he says about the laws. And when he's not representing this woman who paid him a hefty retainer, here is what he said. He said in an article to LA Times, when asked after 9/11, what if they take the people alive who committed this horrendous crime? What if they take alive a Saddam Hussein or a Bin Laden or Mohammed Atta and the masterminds of 9/11? Shouldn't we just summarily execute them? And this is what he said then. It would send a terrible message if we said we're not going to hold a trial. Where would it stop if we did this? I asked that question today. They could have put Sisera on trial, and perhaps he would have been executed. But that's very different from what Yael decided to do on her own. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm asking you to do something that is very strange for Jews. Find someone guilty. Although I'll let you in for a little secret, and you only hear it here. Do you know that the foreperson on the Conrad Murray case was actually a Jew, a member of our own community, a member of Sinai Temple? If he can find guilty, so can you. I know it's hard to sit in judgment of people, but that's why we are taught tzedek tirdov. We believe in justice. Sisera was entitled to a court trial. Guess who would have been the judge? Deborah. Are you worried at all that it would have been a crazy verdict? But at least we would have risen above and said that we believe in justice. And Yael would not have had a right to not only stab a man in the back, but nail him, the very woman he trusted. There was no mercy, there was no law, there was no justice. In fact, she is guilty. Thank you.
Dean Chemerinsky, you may argue for the defendant.
Would you take protective custody? Judge Pines, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it's an honor and a pleasure to appear before you again. I've thought long and hard about the serious charges against my client, first and second degree murder. I've thought about what defenses might be available under the criminal law. I, too, have thought about the Conrad Murray trial. I thought maybe there could be the defense that Sisera administered the fatal blow to himself. Recent events show that defense does not work so well, so I looked elsewhere. I thought of the last trial of the century. I thought maybe I could channel Johnny Cochran and say, if she did not hit, you must acquit. But that too doesn't work. I thought of the ultimate chutzpah defense. Remember the Menendez brothers? You kill your parents, then you beg for mercy because you're an orphan. That too doesn't fit the facts of this case. My field is constitutional law. I thought of constitutional defenses. I think there is a strong case of selective prosecution. Gotti came before you this morning, and for the last 9 years, Prosecutor Levenson has come. And each time, who has she prosecuted? A Jew. Anti-Semitism. And you'll notice the last 2 years, who did she prosecute? Eve and now Yael. Prosecuting strong, heroic Jewish women. On that ground alone, I think you should vote not guilty. I thought of questioning the evidence. I looked at it carefully. Did you notice this says made in China? You can't trust her. But the more I reflected, the more I realized that I was looking at it the wrong way, and that the prosecutor was looking at it the wrong way. This was not a criminal act, but an act during wartime. And the reality now, and the reality has been through history, that killing in war is not regarded as homicide. And so today I just want to make 3 points to you. First, there was a war here. Second, killing in war is not homicide. It's not a crime. And third, this was a killing in war. In terms of first, that a war existed, You've read the passage yourself. The rabbi described it to you earlier this morning. I thought it was telling when Prosecutor Levenson began to describe the story to you. She started in the middle. She didn't start at the beginning, which describes the war in the very first paragraph. It talks about how for 20 years the Israelites had been oppressed. The army commander, not a civilian, but an army commander, was Sisera. It talked about he had 900 iron chariots. He'd oppressed Israel ruthlessly for 20 years. Then in the subsequent paragraphs, it talks about the war that went on. It was a battle. It was with killing. No one can deny that in these facts there was a war. Well, that leads to the second point. Killing in war is not regarded as homicide. It is deemed justifiable. We can look at any source and find authority for this proposition. Several years ago, Gotti gave Laurie and I copies of this book, A Jewish Code of Jewish Ethics. What more authoritative source in this court than that? And so I read to you from page 351, which says, the teaching, when one comes to kill you, kill him first, applies on a national as well as a personal level. Just as an individual has the right to kill anyone trying to kill him, so too, if enemies are trying to destroy your nation or people, you have a right to kill them. In the Bible, Esther helps bring about the hanging of Haman. Though at the time of his execution, Haman had not killed anyone, but arranged for the execution of Esther's cousin Mordecai. The clear upshot of Judaism's law of self-defense is that a nation has the right to go to war or launch a preemptive war against nations or terrorists who attack it or plot against it. You can look at this through history and you find the same thing. Frederick the Great said, the objective of war is the entire destruction of your enemies. Karl von Clausewitz, the leading theorist of war in history, said, the overriding principle of war is the destruction of enemy forces. The first real code of international human rights, of the law of war, was called the Lieber Code. It was promulgated by Abraham Lincoln in 1863 as Army Order 100. And it permits, and I'm quoting, those measures which are indispensable for securing the ends of war, including all direct destruction of life and limb of enemy forces. The current law of war comes from the Geneva Conventions. And Article 23b of the Fourth Hague Convention specifically authorizes the killing of enemy troops, even the commanders of enemy troops. The Army Field Manual states, speaking of the Fourth Hague Convention, this article is construed as prohibiting assassination, prescription, or outlaw of an enemy, or putting a price upon an enemy's head, as well as offering a reward for an enemy dead or alive. It does not, however, preclude attacks on individual soldiers or officers of the enemy, whether in the zone of hostilities, occupied territory, or elsewhere. The Report on Terrorism and Human Rights of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights says, quote, the combatant's privilege in turn is in essence a license to kill or wound enemy combatants and destroy other enemy military objectives. The judge will instruct you, and I quote, the killing of an enemy soldier during wartime under the laws of warfare is not deemed a criminal act and is justifiable homicide. Well, that brings me to the third question, the only one that's relevant here today. Was this a killing as part of war? What you have here is Sisera, the commander of the enemy, and he was killed. Had this occurred just outside the tent, moments earlier, none of us would deny that this was a killing during war. But what the prosecutor focuses on here is the fact that he was killed in his sleep in the tent. She makes several points for you to think of. One, she says over and again, the war was over. Now look at your text. Where does it say that the war was over before this killing occurred? In fact, what the wily prosecutor does is ignore the text in the last paragraph. The war is not over until after this killing occurs. Read the last paragraph, and it says, on that day, God subdued King Jabin and Hazor before the Israelites. The hand of the Israelites bore harder and harder on King Jabin of Canaan until they destroyed King Jabin of Canaan. In other words, the war doesn't end until after this killing occurs. And there's every reason to believe that this killing is what precipitates, what brings about an end of the war. Moreover, look carefully at your text. Does it ever suggest that Yael knew the war was over? Even if the prosecutor is right that the war was over, and I think the text says she's wrong, what you have to ask here is, did Yael have any way to know that the war was over? Nothing here suggests that she could have known that. In fact, nothing here suggests that she could have possibly known that all of Sisera's troops had been killed. She wasn't out on the battlefield. So at most what you have here is a mistake. And the law is clear that if somebody makes a mistake, they're not criminally liable. In fact, we're applying the law of California, which I might question, because of course the defendant's never been to California. But putting that aside, California Penal Code Section 26 says, persons who committed the act or omission charged under an ignorance or mistake of fact that disproves any criminal intent. I can show you cases like People versus Goodman that says, a person who maintains an honest and reasonable belief in the existence of certain facts and circumstances which if true would make such an act of omission lawful is not guilty of a crime. She thought the war was still going on. Find any evidence in your text to suggest otherwise. The prosecutor suggests next that what we should have done here is try the person who was murdered, not have him killed. Now, how was Yael supposed to accomplish this? How was she supposed to apprehend him? She had no weapons. She didn't have a gun in her tent to hold him. Now, maybe she should have gone out of the tent and she should have found some soldiers or police, but she didn't know that the war was over. She had every reason to believe that if she went out of her tent, Sisera's soldiers would have apprehended her, would have murdered her. As the rabbi told you, he was a very large man. She was a small woman. How was she supposed to apprehend him, to try him? The prosecutor is right that an enemy soldier, if possible, should be apprehended and tried under the laws of war, but only if it is possible to do so. When the United States killed bin Laden, it said, it was justified under international law because there was no way to subdue and try him. Find anything in your passage, anything in the evidence that suggests that it was possible to subdue Sisera, possible to try him, given these facts. So what could she do? As an act of war, she killed the commanding officer. Now, the prosecutor suggests that Sisera was really a prisoner of war. He was never captured. He never surrendered. He was never taken prisoner. She had no choice under the laws of war. She had no choice to protect herself but to kill him. And she did so in the only way that was possible for her. She should be celebrated as a hero for turning the tide of war, not prosecuted as a common criminal. Imagine it was you in that tent. Imagine that you believed that the war was still going on, and the commanding officer came in, and you believed that you could change the course of history, the outcome of that war, by killing the commanding officer. Would you have done any differently as Yael? Of course not. That's why you have to vote not guilty on all of the charges.
You call this a book? You know what? I brought a book. My book is by Erwin Chemerinsky. Not surprisingly, it's called The Conservative Assault on the Constitution. And the nice thing about my book is that it is autographed. It says, to Laurie, who is always right. So for over 200 years, he writes, for over 200 years, this nation has adhered to the rule of law with unparalleled success. A shift to a nation based upon extra-constitutional authority is prohibited, as well as ill-advised. He asks us to abide by the rule of law. And now he says, but I don't like those laws. I want the laws that will help my client. And I want you to focus on the law of war because I think it helps my client. But the problem is that it doesn't. And even the words he read to you himself, although he read these words very quickly, say from the Fourth Hague Convention, something that we regularly teach to our first-year law students. This article is construed as prohibiting assassination, proscription, or outlawry of an enemy, or putting a price upon an enemy's head, as well as offering or receiving a reward for your enemy. But isn't that exactly what Yael did? Because you know what? Sisera was not Yael's enemy. The text couldn't be clearer. She was in a neutral position. Her tribe was not part of the war. And if you needed to be directed to it, it is line 17. In fact, there was a friendship. So this is not the scenario where Yael is confronted by some enemy soldier. Oh my God, what's going to happen? This is a poor, pathetic Nebuch who shows up at her door. Help me, save me, they're hunting for me. How does she know the war's over? He's not out there with the troops. He's trying to hide because Barak is after him. So this was not an act of self-defense. It was not an act during a war. And how else do we know that the war is over? I don't know. I read words like, all of Sisera's soldiers fell by the sword, not a man was left. That's a pretty good indication. And what about that last part? He says, and on that day, God subdued King Jabin of Hazor. That day, you're right. That day started long before she nailed him with the pin. God was responsible. And now what he wants to claim is, well, my client is just like God. How dare he? No one has the right to play God. The jury instructions, in fact, will make clear that there was no mistake, no necessity, and no defense. Because even though he wanted to read you the first part of the instruction, Judge Pines will read to you the following. The killing of an enemy soldier during wartime under the laws of warfare is not deemed a criminal act and is justifiable homicide. Gesundheit. Great. Okay? It's a legal expression. But here's what the judge is going to say after that. However, under the laws of war, prisoners shall be at all times be humanely treated and protected, particularly against acts of violence. Measures of reprisal against them are forbidden. When Sisera showed up, he was not like bin Laden. I grant it. When we killed bin Laden, there was an argument that we had to do so in self-defense. They came in, he was up, he had an armed compound. But the same could not be said in this text for Sisera. He is asleep. There is nothing he can do. And when my esteemed opponent says, well, what was she supposed to do? How about what she eventually did do? Which is go out and say, yo, Barak, come this way. He's in my tent. There is nothing that said that she needed to stay there just in case he might wake up and then assault her. Something he never tried to do in the text before she put him asleep. In fact, we know that there is a way to treat those who have been our enemy. You can treat them like Saddam on the side, and he's no longer around either, but at least we were not murderers. Or we can treat them the way the gangs, the riots treated Gaddafi. No friend, But I don't know about you. I'd like you to remember back when it happened. How did you feel seeing it on television? Did it make you proud? Did you say, yes, that's the way we should have justice? We want to identify with the people who took him and tore him limb by limb. I'm asking you in this case, and usually you're saying, oh my God, it's getting so heavy, Laurie, you're usually so much fun. I am. But I actually think that this one's a serious one. I think this is our opportunity to weigh in and say, how do we want justice to be? Do we want it to be just a victor's justice, where we can do whatever we want? Or do we want to follow the teaching of the wisest among us and follow the law of war? Because in this case, she was never at war. She never was. She was a neutral. Everyone had been defeated. She didn't have to do this. You know, I know we all like our heroes. Moses, Joshua, King David, Judah the Maccabee, even Joe Paterno. But if there's anything our tradition teaches us, is that they are all very human, fallible, even criminal. And our responsibility, your responsibility, is to apply the law even when you are happy by what the end results were in this case. Sisera was not killed on the battlefield. No matter how much the professor tries to say that this was during war, he was not killed on the battlefield. He was killed in a woman's bed. And that's not a good precedent for any of us. So I would suggest that the ends don't justify the means. Tzedek, tzedek tirdo. The right result in this case is exactly when you read this text what it said. It was premeditated. She could deliver up the enemy of someone else. She was going to be the big shot. She would be right up there with Deborah, but she would also be guilty. Thank you very much.
I agree with so much of what Laurie Levenson just said. This book is now out in paperback. I've got 2 children to send to college. I also totally agree about the importance of the rule of law. I agree that the ends don't justify the means. But I think to establish that point, the prosecutor has picked the wrong defendant. I too think we have to look at this seriously. And if you look at it seriously and you look at the evidence, I would suggest that the appropriate verdict is not guilty. I think what you have to focus on is the 3 points that I made earlier. First, this was a war. There's no doubt from the text before you that it was a war. Now, Laurie wants to say that the battlefield was someplace else, but it appears that the battlefield was everywhere. We just don't know from the text how far the tent was from the soldiers were shooting and killing each other, but we know it couldn't be very far because he went in a very short amount of time to Yael's tent. It was a war, and war is different. Second, killing during war is not homicide. The law is clear about that. I quoted you from sources, comes from Jewish ethics, ancient generals. The modern law of war is found in the Geneva Convention. In fact, you will be instructed as to this by the judge. It's exactly the words that Laurie read. The killing of an enemy soldier during wartime under the laws of warfare, not deemed a criminal act, and is justifiable homicide. However, the laws of war, prisoners shall at all times be humanely treated and protected, particularly against acts of violence. But where is there any indication that Sisera was a prisoner? Did he surrender? Was he captured? Was he restrained? Think of any characteristic that from common sense would make somebody a prisoner and apply it here. Look at the evidence before you. Look at the text. There's nothing that suggests that he was a prisoner. This was a killing. This was a killing during war. And that's, of course, the third point. And it's really what we disagree about is, should this be regarded as a killing during war? She says, well, Yael wasn't part of this war because her friend was the husband of the rival king. That doesn't deny that she perceived there as being a war. This was a situation where for 20 years the evil king and his general had persecuted the Israeli people. She said the war was over. She said, you know the war was over because Sisera had lost all of his troops. But here again, the prosecutor wants you to ignore the text. It's not until the last paragraph of the text, after the killing, that there's the surrender and the war is over. But even assume that she's right, that the war was over. Is there any indication whatsoever that Yael knew the war was over? Now, what Laurie does is say, well, he came into her tent and he was exhausted. Soldiers are often exhausted during battle. The fact that he was exhausted and came in the tent is hardly evidence that she knew that the war was over. So here you have to focus on another instruction that the judge will read to you. It's the instruction concerning mistake. Because at worst here, she made a mistake. And the judge will tell you, quote, the defendant is not guilty of murder if she did not have the intent or mental state required to commit the crime. If she reasonably did not have a fact, reasonably mistakenly believed a fact. If the defendant's conduct were lawful in the fact she reasonably believed them to be, she did not commit the crime charged. She had every reason to believe the war was still going on. The most powerful argument that Laurie makes to you is that it is much better to try those we capture than to kill them. I could not agree more if it's reasonable to do so under the circumstances. What could she do under these circumstances? She had no ability to restrain him. Laurie says, well, she could have gone out and sought aid. But as far as she knew, the war was still raging. She did not know how long he would be asleep. And remember, he, according to the rabbi, was much larger than she was. She was in danger. The only thing that she could think to do was to kill the enemy commander. This isn't the only time in history that this happened. There's the very famous story of Pepin, the father of Charlemagne, crossing the Rhine and killing the enemy commander in his bedchambers while asleep. And we honor him as a hero. Remember the context as you hand down your verdict. For 20 years, the king and Sisera had persecuted the Israeli people. Imagine that it was 1945. And imagine that you had been in hiding. You didn't know that the tide of the war turned. And imagine that Hitler came into your home, or Hitler's top general, and you had the chance to be able to end the war, to turn the tide of history. Would you have done any differently than Yael did under those circumstances? The reality is, war is different. Killing in war is different. This was a killing during war. And so under the instructions from the judge, the only verdict should be, as to both counts, not guilty.
Want to make it clear, it's up to all of you and you alone to decide what happened based only on the evidence that has been presented to you in this trial. Do not let bias, sympathy, prejudice, or public opinion influence your decision. Bias includes, but is not limited to, bias for or against the attorneys, defendant, or the alleged victim. You must follow the law as I explain it to you, even if you disagree with it. If you believe that the attorney's comments on the law conflict with my instructions, you must follow my instructions. As I mentioned, the instructions I'm reading to you are the actual instructions that we read to jurors every day in courthouses throughout the state of California. A key instruction in criminal cases is the instruction on reasonable doubt. And I'm going to read to you the pertinent language. The fact that a criminal charge has been filed against a defendant is not evidence that the charge is true. You must not be biased against the defendant just because she has been charged with a crime or brought to trial. A defendant in a criminal case is presumed to be innocent. This presumption requires that the people prove a defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is proof that leaves you with an abiding conviction that the charge is true. The evidence need not eliminate all possible doubt because everything in life is open to some possible or imaginary doubt. In deciding whether the people have proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt, you must impartially compare and consider all the evidence that was received throughout the trial. And this is important. Unless the evidence proves the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, she's entitled to an acquittal, and you must find her not guilty. The defendant is charged with murder. To prove that a defendant is guilty of this crime, the people must prove, 1, the defendant committed an act that caused the death of another person, and 2, when the defendant acted, she acted with malice aforethought. There are 2 kinds of malice aforethought: express malice and implied malice. Proof of either is sufficient to establish the state of mind required for murder. The defendant acted with malice if she unlawfully intended to kill. The defendant acted with implied malice if she intentionally committed an act, the natural consequences of which were dangerous to human life. Malice aforethought does not require hatred or ill will toward the victim. It is a mental state that must be formed before the act that causes death is committed. It does not require deliberation or the passage of any particular period of time. Now, there are 2 kinds of murder that are charged here, first and second degree murder, and you are to decide whether the charge in this case is first or second degree murder, and whether the defendant has been convicted of either. The defendant is guilty of first degree murder if the people have proved that she acted willfully, deliberately, and with premeditation. The defendant acted willfully if she intended to kill. The defendant acted deliberately if she carefully weighed the considerations for and against her choice, and knowing the consequences, decided to kill. The defendant acted with premeditation if she decided to kill before committing the act that caused the death. The length of time a person spends considering whether to kill does not alone determine whether the killing is deliberate and premeditated. The amount of time required for deliberation and premeditation may vary from person to person and according to the circumstances. A decision to kill made rashly, impulsively, or without careful consideration is not deliberate and premeditated. On the other hand, a cold, calculated decision to kill can be reached quickly. The test is the extent of the reflection, not the length of time. An act done with premeditation is first-degree murder. All other murders are of the second degree. The defendant is not guilty of murder if she did not have the intent or mental state required to commit the crime because she reasonably did not know a fact or reasonably and mistakenly believed a fact. If the defendant's conduct would have been lawful under the facts as she reasonably believed them to be, she did not commit the crime charged. There's also a defense here of justifiable homicide. The killing of an enemy soldier during wartime under the laws of warfare is not deemed a criminal act and is justifiable homicide. However, under the laws of war, prisoners shall at all times be humanely treated and protected, particularly against acts of violence. Measures of reprisal against them are forbidden. So those are the instructions. You all have jury forms. Now, you must understand that you must first consider whether the people have proved the defendant committed murder, and that has to be proof beyond a reasonable doubt. If you find that she did commit murder, you must then decide whether she is guilty or not guilty of first-degree murder. If you find her not guilty of first-degree murder, then decide whether she is guilty or not guilty of second-degree murder. So that, ladies and gentlemen, completes the formal instructions of law. On a personal note, I wanted to say a couple of things. Every day in our courts in this county, we summon jurors to serve in criminal trials and in civil trials. Often people look at that as an inconvenience. We never get a turnout like this where every seat is sold out. And let's be frank, the reason is because we have such amazing, brilliant advocates, such as Dean Chemerinsky and Professor Laurie Levenson. I wish I could appoint them to serve as counsel in every one of my cases. It'd be a lot easier to bring jurors and a lot more entertaining. This has, again, been a pleasure for me. I hope it's all been a pleasure for you. You know, obviously there's been a lot that's entertaining here, but there's been a lot of wisdom imparted, not just by the rabbi, but by the lawyers as well, in terms of their arguments. And so I hope this has been not only an entertaining experience for you, but a learning experience as well. So thank you very much. Please complete your verdict forms.